But no, I think it is a very scary time, and it's in a way it's kind of the most important time in my life to be a skeptic.
You are listening to the Why Smart Women podcast, the podcast that helps smart women work out why we repeatedly make the wrong decisions and how to make better ones. From relationships, career choices, finances, to faux fur jackets and kale smoothies. Every moment of every day, we're making decisions. Let's make them good ones. I'm your host, Annie McCubbin, and as a woman of a certain age, I've made my own share of really bad decisions. Not my husband. I don't mean him, though. I did go through some shockers to find him. And I wish this podcast had been around to save me from myself. This podcast will give you insights into the working of your own brain, which will blow your mind. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording and you are listening on this day. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. This is part 2 of my interview with the brilliant Michael Marshall. If you haven't listened to part 1, I suggest you do. Enjoy.
The Why Smart Women podcast is brought to you by Coup, a boutique training, coaching and media production company. A coup, spelt C-O-U-P, is a decisive act of leadership, and decisive leadership requires critical thinking. So well done you for investing time to think about your thinking. If your leadership or relationships would benefit from some grounded and creative support, if you want team training or a conference presentation, reach out for a confidential one-on-one conversation using the link in the description, or go to coup.co.
I have had conspiracy theorists offered to come on the podcast, and I can't have them on. I'm an actor. I don't have a science background. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. If you hand me a study that's something, whatever that's got scientific terms, I don't know, could be right. I cannot counter those arguments. I guess what you're saying is, though, I could say, please help me to understand how it is.
Yeah, exactly. What does that term mean? This term that I don't understand it, so my listeners won't understand it. Could you explain this term? And what you might find is, no, they don't have a good explanation for that term because they're using the science paper as a shield and not as a light. They're not trying to illuminate, they're trying to defend themselves, using this paper to deflect any kind of criticism. And so I wanted to stay undercover there. But what I found was almost everybody, every speaker that got up on stage, partly they talked very little about the flat earth. They talked about other conspiracy theories, NASA's a tool of the New World Order and all this kind of stuff. The moon landing was faked. They would bring up different models of the flat earth that were in conflict with one another and point out why each of those models is wrong. Awesome. And the audience would sit and listen to one model, and then they'd sit and listen to the next model, which is fundamentally incompatible with what they just heard. And they wouldn't in any way see the incompatibility because the important thing is everyone else is wrong. Doesn't matter what version right we are, as long as everyone else is wrong. And that's that. And that is that sort of confirmation bias, identity protective cognition. The most important thing here for me is that I belong and I feel right and you're wrong. It's the whole othering thing. Yeah, it is. And I think that's why it will lead to extremism. Or it can be led into extremism. Things like, you can almost draw a straight line. The algorithm tweaks slightly and people go from being flat earthers to QAnon supporters to COVID conspiracy theorists to 15-minute city conspiracy theorists to central bank digital currencies and into the trans panic and the pink panic which will sort of follow. So I think there is a sort of a line there. And I think one of the reasons it will lead to extremism is because you've left mainstream society. You become a flat earther, say. You talk to your friends and family, they think that's ridiculous. If you're sat down the pub with your mates, they're not going to listen. And in many ways, historically, that would have kept you from going too far because, you're right, maybe I won't keep talking about those things. And eventually, if you don't talk about something for long enough, your focus is going to shift somewhere else and your views will shift without you realizing. But now everybody can just go and find the people who will... A group. Exactly. A group that will completely agree with them, that will affirm, that will say, well, it's not just that, it's even more, actually. And if you're in that group and you're isolated away from your friends and family, you spend more and more time in this group, maybe on Telegram or something, and you come across stuff that you find repugnant, morally objectionable, stuff that you can't get on board with, are you going to leave that group as well? Because
No.
once you've left a second
No.
society,
Yeah.
will you find a third society? I don't
Yeah.
think you will. So maybe you will sit there and, in the metaphorical online pub and let Dave go on about Jewish people more than you would have done in your previous friendship group, because you can't afford to leave this. And that becomes a drumbeat that you become first, you become deaf to. You no longer spot it when it becomes bad. And before you know it, you're allowing people to parrot it and maybe even parroting bits of it yourself. Look, I don't believe in everything he says, but he's got a point about this thing over here.
I'm not racist, but... That's
exactly.
I'm not racist,
exactly
but
that.
right, they're taking
it's
our
not
jobs.
all Jewish people. It's just the powerful, wealthy
Yeah.
elites who are the ones who are eating babies and drinking adrenochrome and things.
And in the caverns underneath the synagogues. Yeah, that is.
Exactly.
I think it's so interesting that notion that once you are isolated from your family, then it gets really, really dangerous. And you're so right. It's the extrapolation of information on the internet. It's all different now. You can find anybody that believes in anything, right?
And there are platforms that are actively looking to try and connect you with those people, because the more time you spend online, the more time they'll be able to serve you ads. I mean, one of the things that made QAnon become such a huge phenomenon, when it was posting to 4chan, people weren't picking it up. People weren't spreading it particularly. It didn't go wild. It didn't really go wild until it left 4chan into spaces like YouTube and Facebook.
Right.
And Facebook at one point was actively recommending QAnon groups to people who were yoga lovers and various other things. Not
yes,
because
it's interesting.
They
that,
didn't,
right?
Yeah, and they had they didn't want people to believe in QAnon. They didn't know what QAnon was. They weren't looking at the words. They were looking at the numbers. Like, this group has this many people. It's got this many comments. This regular back and forth going on. The conversation is going on this kind of regularly back and forth. This is a high engagement group. If we get people into this high engagement group, they will stay engaged on our platform and we can serve them more ads. And they were essentially content neutral, value neutral on the content. We don't care what the words or the images are. What we care about is the structure of the group and can we keep you in it. And the problem is they would therefore go off and be whispering to people essentially, hey, I know you're looking at baby photos from your friend from school, but have you ever thought about joining this conspiracy theory about Jewish elites drinking the blood of babies? You might be interested. And YouTube was doing the same thing. And these platforms grew those movements. And then when those movements got out of control, they said, oh, I'll just tweak the algorithm to be something else. But it didn't fundamentally change their incentive structure, and so it stopped turning people into flat earthers and started turning them into QAnoners, and it started turning the next thing. And so when I was even at the flat Earth convention, I said the flat Earth is. I wrote about this, I think, for the Guardian or Gizmodo at the time. I wrote a couple of articles for each. I was saying the flat Earth is just the most visible of the beliefs that they have that are outside of the mainstream, and it will only take a spark to light this into something really dangerous. And I wrote that, I think, in late 2018, and 12 months later there was a wet market in China that provided the spark, and March 2020 we saw how dangerous this kind of conspiracy theorizing can become.
Yeah. And of course I think in a way QAnon has sort of morphed into MAGA. Do you think? It's like a Make America Great Again is now
absolutely. It's become mainstreamed in. And I heard a really interesting, and I won't go into too much of the theory, I had a really fascinating theory from a researcher who looks into the way that these extremist movements build. And he was saying essentially when it was on places like 4chan, 4chan, for people who don't know, is this pretty awful website where kind of anything goes and people pretend to be anything. But because people are saying, oh, actually, I'm a really famous actor and I know this about Hollywood, everyone knows they're not. It's just kind of a collective fiction of people coming along and pretending to be something and writing this collective fiction. And that's kind of what QAnon was. There were lots of people who were anonymously being lots of different things. So I'm definitely this person here. And everyone's like, yes, you aren't, but we're going to pretend like you are and just join in this kind of collective fiction game. When that spilled from a website whose grammatical structure is we know not to take this too seriously into Facebook, where it was there's my friend who's celebrating her wedding anniversary, and there's someone from work who's gone to the park today, and there's a piece of information about the Democrats and the deep state, and here's someone's new dog. it's removed from the structure of we know this isn't true, and it's suffused through your real life, and people therefore lost all of the signs that this isn't to be taken really seriously as literal. And
it just
and that's
becomes
kind of why
normalized. It just becomes normalized in the sea of all the other things. What do you think about sort of there's English cardiologists that come out? Because I find that really difficult, and talk to Joe Rogan and go, I'm a cardiologist, and COVID has caused, whatever it's called. I think, what's the heart condition they think it's caused?
Myocarditis. Yeah. So I know the cardiologist you have in mind. Our magazine awarded him the pseudoscientist of the year a couple of years ago because he did use not just his medical background, but he was really, I'm not going to say famous, but he was very well connected in the media. So he was one of these people that if you saw a newspaper article about this latest dietary thing, they'd always have a quote from a doctor, and he'd be the quote in there. And he'd written a diet book previously. He's a cardiologist. He'd written a diet book about how to extend your life based on the diet of people from a small Italian village called Pioppi. And it was ridiculed by the British Dietetic Association for being one of the worst fad diets imaginable, because it was on the premise that you, like the Italians, have to cut all carbs out of your diet. The people in this Italian village had no carbs, like famously Italian food, quite carby, pasta, pizzas, things like that.
Hello, pasta.
So it was just this ridiculous thing. But yeah, you have these people who I think, and I won't talk too much about the doctor in person. I've not named him. I know he can be quite litigious.
Yes, I'm not naming him either deliberately.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think it's interesting when there are people who've got a level of background of expertise that certainly can parlay into a strong media presence, even if you didn't spend a particularly long time being a professional medical doctor. So you even if you hadn't spent many years in hospitals and things, but it was actually a relatively short time before you go into private practice, say.
Yep.
And now you are a doctor, and you can be in the newspapers talking about diet when you're a cardiologist, and you can then talk about the vaccine when you're not a virologist. You can publish papers about how the vaccine is ineffective, and I think there was a paper that was published in which made claims about the dangers of the vaccine.
Yes.
And I know it was published in a journal for diabetes.
Yep.
And maybe that's because you're on the editorial board of that journal. And maybe that's why you can publish a virology paper in a diabetes journal. So you can use access to these structures, but without necessarily going through what other colleagues would call the most rigorous of science. But the average person can't tell the difference between a doctor who's speaking out because they are steeped in virology and a doctor who's speaking out because they have personal experiences that lead them to believe things that aren't true.
Yeah, we just see the word doctor, and you know it's an immediate argument from authority, right? It just goes straight into the
especially
emotional.
When they can do the lingo. They can talk about specific heart conditions. They can talk about specific proteins and receptors and things because they've got the medical training.
Yeah, that's right. And it sounds absolutely valid, doesn't it?
And I watched the Joe Rogan episode. In fact, so one of the other things that I've been doing this year is I've got a show called the No Rogan Experience.
Yes.
Yeah, where I watch Joe Rogan, then point out exactly what are the conversational tactics that are happening here, because Joe Rogan is the perfect sponge for misinformation because he doesn't. Yeah, he's not going into most of those conversations deliberately trying to spread misinformation, but he's kind of. As misinformation washes to the bottom of the barrel, it's going to hit someone like Joe Rogan, who is just a perfect kind of avatar for it.
And he sounds so certain, right? There's something about that low, that voice and those. They're so certain. Americans just have it all over, I reckon. The English and the Australians, because of the certainty. Absolutely. They're just, everything they say sounds really right. Whereas we always...
I think it's true.
Yep. Whereas we sort of sounds like we're trying hard.
Interesting with the other thing that's interesting with Joe is that I think he is onto something in that he has these long conversations and he thinks that makes things seem more authentic.
Yes.
And I think he's right. I think you do get to something more interesting 2 hours, 3 hours into a conversation where people have exhausted the talking points they wanted to bring up on the show, and you can start to have a conversation about who they really are. But the problem that always comes up with Joe Rogan in those conversations is he has no sense of whether the person talking to him is being honest or not, is being accurate or not.
But does he care?
I think he does. I think he does to a degree. I think it's hard. I think he is genuinely... He wants to be told things that are true, but he also wants to be told things that agree with him. And if there's a conflict there, he'll favor the latter every single time.
Yeah.
And I think that is the problem. We all want to be told things that agree with us, but we all have to also train ourselves to want to be told things that are true that disagree with us, even if that causes us small amounts of emotional distress. We have to kind of embrace that rather than protect ourselves from it. And Joe is all about protecting himself from those moments, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's such a big part of skepticism, or just trying to lead a fairly decent, constructive life, is just understanding that a strong feeling is not necessarily an arbiter of whether you're right or not. It's just a strong feeling. And yet it's so easy to go, you've said this, I'm really offended, I don't agree, I've got a strong feeling, I'm now going to act on it. Trying to manage or calibrate your way through your emotions, I think, is so important. And I think for us now, especially in the face of RFK in the States, I think we skeptics have to really be prepared to do the best job we can to start to counter the arguments. And I don't know, I guess that's what's worried me the most, is when RFK took the reins, because of because of funding, for starters. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, at the start that you were talking about kind of the emotion of it as well. I think, first of all, as skeptics, we have to admit that we also have emotions, and that
100%.
Emotions aren't necessarily bad. You know, people will say, well, you know, that you've got too emotional in this argument and therefore you've lost. And it's like, no, we're all emotional about this. If you think you aren't being emotional, you're being self-deceptive at that point, and you're going to get into some... Yeah. Exactly. We're all powered by our emotions. That's 100%. Kind of what our brain does. Yeah. But no, I think it is a very scary time, and it's in a way, it's kind of the most important time in my life to be a skeptic, because when I first got involved in skepticism, it was a lot about things like psychics, and I care an awful lot about people being deceptive about their psychic abilities. Yeah. But there are fewer harms to that than there are to anti-vax rhetoric, or than there are to having an anti-vaxxer in power with the bullhorn being able to say anything that they want. So it can feel like the hardest time to be a skeptic, but it's also the most essential time to be a skeptic, to be able to be pushing back, but also to be pushing back effectively, because there are people who believe what RFK is saying. And if we say, well, RFK is awful, and anyone who believes him is an idiot, what we're saying is, let's say there's 15% of America that we're now saying is an idiot. Yeah. That 15% could probably be useful to a political project or a project of rationalism if you could persuade some of them to question why they believe in RFK. If you call them an idiot, they're definitely not going to. So do you want to write those people off, or do you want to fish in that pool to see who are the ones you can bring back? And I'd always much rather bring people back to, even if we can't get them over the line into pure rationality or into net rationality, I'd rather get them closer to or further away from irrationality, to kind of, okay, maybe you're not going to be perfect about everything, but we can stop you falling worse and worse on these particular topics.
So I guess what you're talking about is using the principles we've discussed in the last 40 minutes, but using them in a larger pool. Because how do you do that? How do we influence when there is so many people now that are in danger and are vulnerable to this disinformation? How do we do that in a larger sense?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult, and I don't have the perfect answer, because if I did, the world would be working so much better.
You'd be running the world, Michael, and then everything would be fine. I'd be the vice president, and I'd be awesome.
Yeah, we'd have it nailed.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things we can do is recognize where are people's needs, where are people's fears, insecurities. People aren't following RFK because he's the most convincing person with the best evidence. They're following him, and they're following the people around him because he is speaking to something that they are scared of. He's speaking to something that they are concerned about, and he's not giving the right answers to those things, but he's recognized that they exist. And so we first have to spot and recognize what those fears are, what those insecurities are, before we can start filling them with the right answers. So and partly that kind of has to come from listening to people as well. We have to actually be in the spaces where people are expressing what it is they're worried about. It's so easy for us to find people who are anti-vaxxers, for example, or even not. I'm not going to say anti-vaxxers with a capital A of like you are committed to the lifestyle, but people who are persuaded by some of this rhetoric, who are parroting some of this rhetoric, who would have been on the fence but have been kicked over the fence onto the other side. We need to be able to hear what they're saying and hear what they're worried about without focusing that conversation first on correcting them. Because otherwise what happens is we come in with a list of talking points and say, okay, who are you? And they tell me something and I read off my first talking point about why they're wrong, and then they say something else and I read my second point, and I have no idea what the bit in between was, but they may have said something that would actually have changed the way I talk to them, that would actually change my perception of them and make me more effective at communicating. So we have to listen first. It's why I go undercover to flat earth meetings. It's why I go along to anti-vax rallies and listen and hear what people are saying. It's why I go and spend a year and a half in an anti-vax Telegram group. I need to understand who they are before I can explain why they're wrong, or explain to them why they're wrong. So I think, one of the most important things we can do as skeptics is listen first for where the insecurities are. The more we listen, the more we'll be able to distinguish between the stuff that's just thrown out as flack to stop you paying attention to the real vulnerabilities, and the stuff that's genuinely true and genuinely who they are and what they're worried about. Once we get to that bit, that's when we can actually be effective. We can actually hear what their real concerns are and try and do something about it.
Because certainly, if you look at MAGA, there'd have to be such a high level of people, the population being disenfranchised, being marginalised, losing their jobs, there's no healthcare. I mean, there'd be a large portion of them that have really struggled for a really long time. They didn't just arise out of a sort of a privileged environment where everything was going swimmingly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm not American. I haven't spent a huge amount of time in America. I would say the insecurity around healthcare is something that is
massive.
going to have huge downstream effects on people. Once your ability to stay healthy is inherently tied to your job, and your job may not be secure, then your world isn't secure. Because if one goes away and then the second one goes away, you are very quickly plunged into a level of insecurity. And if somebody comes along and says, first of all, I'm going to give you a perfect healthcare. What the previous guy did had gaps around the edges and it was difficult and complicated. And I've talked to American friends, and the American healthcare system seems wildly overcomplicated, even to people who have good health insurance.
Absolutely.
You have to fight uphill battles. You have to, there's bureaucracy every stage designed to stop you getting the help that you need. That is something that is, if you're privileged enough to have a good education and the time to be able to have those conversations, you might be able to navigate. But I know that if my parents are American, they left school without an education. They don't work in jobs where they use literacy a great deal. I think they'd struggle to navigate those systems, and they'd find themselves in healthcare insecurity. And who knows what that would make them vulnerable to. So I think then,
of course, I'm offering you a supplement. I'm saying, you've got these issues, have this supplement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, make America healthy again. We'll stop. The answer isn't medicine; it's to prevent you from being ever ill in the first place. Well, we'd all love to be prevented from being ill. If what RFK was saying was true, it'd be great. The problem is it isn't. The problem is it's the soundbite that is persuasive.
100%. And this notion that if everybody just ate better, because it's a very it's a big banner statement, isn't it, that food is medicine. I hear it all the time. Food is not medicine. Food is food. Medicine is medicine. But this notion that if you can just eat properly and then just take all the dyes out of the food and the preservatives, so then the focus goes on to the dyes and the preservatives. And besides anything else, most people can't afford to eat 5 vegetables and 5 portions of fruit and lean protein a day. They can't afford to. So it's a nonsense statement in the first place, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you, in RFK's case, were born into the Kennedy family, it's maybe not hard to be able to find good access to good food and maybe even the time to spend to cook it. I mean, RFK has never been a single parent who had to work 2 jobs to be able to keep the lights on and keep their kid going to school. These kinds of extra pressures have downstream impacts on people, and I think it's incredibly important that we provide a safety net for those people. I live in a country where everybody gets healthcare, and that's a hugely good thing.
And here in Australia as well, it's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it wouldn't cover everything, but it would cover a huge amount of the gaps that people can fall into. But the other thing that the RFK style of food is medicine, what that allows is if you did fall ill, it was your own fault.
It's your own
or
fault.
rather, if you see somebody who's ill, it's their fault.
Yep.
They should have eaten better.
Yep.
Which allows you to absolve yourself of not just of responsibility for
but
each
compassion.
other, but also of compassion. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're this way. I mean, that's why I've spent so much time swimming around in the whole spiritual arena where you create your illness. You haven't resolved something, you've created this illness. If you actually did the right amount of meditation, the right amount of manifestation, the right amount of visualization, you cure yourself, it's your fault. And that I find incredibly frustrating. And it's the same thing, there's no compassion in that, for the fact that people, often most of the problems that beset us are structural.
And it's something that I spent a while looking into around fake cancer cures. There was one in particular, Gerson therapy was popular for a while.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's set up to be, and I don't think it was designed this way, like cynically, but the way that the regime works is that you have to take 12 different coffee enemas a day, 12 different fruit juices, 8 coffee enemas.
Yeah.
Incredibly difficult to do, even if you were well, to take a fruit juice every hour on the hour.
Yeah.
If you were well, that'd be a difficult thing to do without slipping, without making a mistake somewhere down the line. If you're unwell, you're going to make a mistake. If you make a mistake, well, that's why it didn't work.
It's
that's
your
why
fault.
you still died of cancer. You didn't do the regime properly. If you do the regime right. I was once in a room in like an event space in a Holiday Inn here in Liverpool, where an American Gerson therapist had come over to talk about Gerson therapy to a room, about 100 people in the room. Again, we were undercover in the room. And he said, "Who here's got cancer?" And half the room put their hands up.
Oh, it upsets
and
me.
It was one of the hardest rooms I've ever been in, genuinely the hardest room I've ever been in, because then he was asking people in the front row, what chemotherapeutic drugs are you on? And they would name the drug, and he would say, okay, yeah, you need to stop taking that, because if you're taking that with my thing, it won't save you. It won't save you at all.
Then they die.
I think people in that room didn't survive. I know of people who were in that room who are no longer with us. But if you were to say to anyone in that room, this guy is having you on, this will kill you, you're the bad guy who's going to take away hope from them. Why are you trying? What harm could it do?
Yeah,
so
where's the harm is the big cry of the people that I talk to that are sort of promoting alt med. It's where's the harm? I'll tell you where the harm is, because it takes you, it takes your focus over here. And you might, maybe you're taking a supplementary vitamin, but then maybe you stop the chemo and then you've only got the vitamins and then you're nowhere. I had a friend recently who had discovered, very fit person, but discovered he needed a triple bypass. And he rang me. He said, I've just read a book, I won't name the doctor, by this doctor who says that the problems for all of us with heart disease is leptins in the food. Yeah, you know who the doctor is. And he said, so I'm thinking of trying that. And I said, well, so then we went to the surgeon, and the surgeon showed him a picture and said, here's these 3 blockages. My advice to you is don't run for the bus, and you can come in for surgery, because it's awesome. It's Australia. And he had a triple bypass. I think it was like 5 days later. But that's the danger. He was thinking, I don't want to have surgery. Surgery is scary. Right, it's horrible. They've got to open your chest up. I just want to take a vitamin and stop eating leptins.
Yeah, and I can understand. Again, we have to have compassion. Especially if you look at something like cancer, you go and see a doctor, and the doctor will say, oh, this is good. There is a 80% chance of a 5-year survival on this. 85%. And people at that point don't hear 80%; they hear 20%. 20% chance I'm not around in 5 years.
Yeah.
And then you talk to a cancer quack. They don't have to talk couched in probabilities. They can talk in certainties, because they're not burdened by the need to be accurate.
Yes.
Because they're not regulated. They don't have the oversight of the right answer of things that are actually true. So they say, no, it's fine. You do this and you will survive.
And that's what we want. It's back to that notion of the high appeal of certainty. We all want certainty.
Absolutely.
I would like it. I would love certainty, but we don't have it. We live in this life. It is uncertain. We do the best we can. Yep.
Yeah, completely that. And I think the other thing is what's the harm? People will say, like people who are patients will say, well, I've already got a terminal diagnosis, so what's the harm in trying this? And so I spent time looking through. There were a lot of people who were doing things like crowdfunders to go to Germany for the miracle cure. What's the harm in trying this miracle cure? And they'd be in the newspapers all the time. This person raising money. There's a local fundraisers. Local football team is auctioning off equipment. All sorts of things like this. And when you follow those stories through, the one thing the media never does, even if they do say which clinic they're going to or which country or what they're getting, never does a follow-up, looks at what the evidence is.
Never.
And so if you look at individual stories and you say to that person, that cancer patient, this isn't going to work, you're the bad guy. If you say to their friends and family, you're the bad guy. If you say to the people who stick $5 in their GoFundMe, you're still the bad guy, because someone who's throwing $5 in because they were moved by a story they saw in the newspaper hasn't got the time or the inclination to engage in what's the evidence for this, necessarily. They just want to do a nice thing for someone they've not met.
Yep.
So the way that I tackled this problem in the UK was to look on GoFundMe, on Just Giving, on every crowdfunding page for every single story like that I could find over a year period. I think spent 6 months looking for every single one that I could find to see how many of these stories are there, how much is being raised, where is it going, and then also what happened to this person after they went to the clinic. And I was able to find, I forget the numbers, maybe about 300 stories, something like that.
Wow.
And I was able to find more than 100 of them were promoted as positive stories, cure stories in the newspaper. I was able to find more than 80, I think, obituaries within the time frame that the doctors had said, this is what you've got. And when you see some of the personal stories in there, what you see is people had raised £50,000 on GoFundMe to go to this German clinic and to stay there because it's incredibly expensive, and you stay on site and your friends and family stay there, and a huge expensive thing. You don't turn first to GoFundMe. The first thing you do isn't go to a crowdfunder. You spend your own money. You remortgage your house. You talk to your parents. You do anything where there's sources of money. So what happens is when the person does go to these clinics, and they pass away in the time that the doctors initially gave them. They initially feel better because they've stopped taking chemotherapy, so they feel better. They're told that means they're getting better, and then they're suddenly terminal, and not only are they going to die, but they also haven't dealt with the fact they're going to die because they've been told they aren't dying. Their family have been told you're not dying. You go there with your wife's got cancer, as a husband you're there to support her, and then she dies. You've been told that's not going to happen. And then you also realise that you're now in huge amounts of debt because you spent every penny on this treatment. What's the harm in trying it? If it could possibly work, I've got nothing to lose. Well, what you have to lose is the time with the person that you love.
Yeah.
Accepting that what's going on, and if you wanted to spend 50 grand, there's better ways to spend 50 grand than to go to a clinic in Germany and pay for uncomfortable treatments.
And so, did you take that exploratory? So you did that exploration. Did you? Was that disseminated anywhere? Did people read that?
Yeah, so it was the cover story of the BMJ in September 2018, I think it was, and then it was in a whole range of national newspapers. We had it on the BBC as well, and there was a BBC kind of film about it too, in which the clinic actually pushed back, and the BBC removed the story because of the legal threats from the clinic, because this was a huge source of money for one of these clinics, and if you've got that kind of money, you've got the lawyers that the money gives you access to. But once we published this, I wrote to every journalist who'd ever written one of these stories, and the health editor of every single newspaper who'd ever published one of these stories, to say, you don't realise this, but your stories here were being used as advertising for these clinics. In the UK, if you took out a full page in a newspaper saying, I can cure your cancer, that would be illegal. We have literally a law called the Cancer Act against the advertising of cancer cures. These clinics didn't need to take out adverts because they had something even more powerful than adverts. They had patient testimonies. The patients were going to these papers. The clinic was encouraging patients to go to the papers. If you're low on money and you need to pay for this, here's a great route. Here's a great way of doing it. Here's how you set up a GoFundMe. Here's how you talk to your local journalists. So they were doing this. And so I said, without you realizing, your stories have been used to recruit patients to these clinics. And I saw heartbreaking chains where a patient would go to this clinic, they'd stop taking chemotherapy, they'd become a testimony about how great they're feeling. Somebody would say in their another fundraiser, I didn't think there was hope until I saw that story. And that's why I knew to go to this clinic. By the time this second patient gets to the clinic, I've already seen the obituary for the first person.
Yep.
And I saw that chain happen with 3 links. There was a third patient who saw the second patient.
Awful.
And I sent this to the journalist to say, your story is the one in the middle of this link. If your story doesn't exist, this second person who they said they saw your story, that's how they went.
And did the story stop?
We don't see anywhere near as many of those stories anymore.
Good.
So it used to be you'd see one of those stories in the British press every week, and now we will go months without seeing any of them. And I'm not saying it was directly just because I wrote to those journalists.
Yeah, well, I bet it helped, Michael. I bet that helped.
Getting it all out there, getting the other side of it out there.
Yeah.
And this is what I was saying about how if you were to talk to the patient, you're the bad guy. To their friends and family, you're the bad guy. To the donors, you're the bad guy. Even just writing to the journalist at that point to say, I think this is irresponsible, they may or may not listen because they've got so much else to do. There's so much pressure in journalism to write 7 stories a day. But by doing that incredibly painstaking and at times quite harrowing work of looking through hundreds and hundreds of these cases and documenting the trends and showing the data, using that kind of bigger picture, we actually have had an appreciable success here. And even the platforms have stopped allowing some of these clinics or certain types of therapy to be mentioned in GoFundMes, which means it cuts off that supply line of victims to these clinics.
That is awesome. That is really and truly, that's a really, really positive, fantastic story. Difficult, I'm sure, and grueling and quite heartbreaking. But the fact that you did that makes me feel like I'm going to keep going, Michael. I'm going to keep
well, that's all I was looking for.
I'm going
that's
to
all
keep
I ever
fighting
want.
the good fight. Well, on that note, it has been an absolute delight to talk to you. And thank you for getting up at the crack of dawn at 8:30 a.m. in the morning in Britain.
That makes me sound so bad because other people get up routinely at that time. I'm very much a night person, but I was very happy to do it. It's been a pleasure chatting to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'll let you know when this is up and running. It will be quite soon. And thank you. Thank you so much, smart women. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that you found that instructive. I certainly did. It's challenged quite a bit of my thinking, which is what I'm always up for. So have a lovely day. Stay safe. Keep your critical thinking hats on. Talk soon. Bye. Thanks for tuning in to Why Smart Women with me, Annie McCubbin. I hope today's episode has ignited your curiosity and left you feeling inspired by my anti-motivational style. Join me next time as we continue to unravel the fascinating layers of our brains and develop ways to sort out the fact from the fiction and the over 6,000 thoughts we have in the course of every day. Remember, intelligence isn't enough. You can be as smart as paint, but it's not just about what you know, it's about how you think. And in all this talk of whether or not you can trust your gut, if you ever feel unsafe, whether it's in the street, at work, in a car park, in a bar, or in your own home, please respect that gut feeling. Staying safe needs to be our primary objective. We can build better lives, but we have to stay safe to do that. And don't forget to subscribe, rate and review the podcast and share it with your fellow smart women and allies. Together, we're hopefully reshaping the narrative around women and making better decisions. So until next time, stay sharp, stay savvy, and keep your critical thinking hat shiny. This is Annie McCubbin signing off from Why Smart Women. See you later. This episode was produced by Harrison Hess. It was executive produced and written by me, Annie McCubbin.